national security state was the National Security Act of 1947, which began to be put together just a few days after something fell from the skies at Roswell, New Mexico in July of 1947. And by August, they're cobbling together quickly this National Security Act, and in September, they actually held President Truman, delayed him on the tarmac there at National Airport when he was trying to get home to visit his dying mother, so they could rush on board and get him to sign this National Security Act of 1947. Why the rush? Well, because they had to get control over all of this information. And what the National Security Act of 1947 did was create the CIA and also change the name of the Defense Department, War Department, to the Defense Department, a little public relations move. And but also in there, and what has been little noticed, was the creation of the National Security Council. Well, by very definition, that's in charge of anything that has to do with national security. UFOs, national security. Nazi infiltration, national security. High technology, national security. And since the National Security Council, and we hear this all the time, almost any time that we've gone to fight some brush fire war and the Iran-Contra scandal, on, it's always the National Security Council that's involved. And yet, I bet you virtually no one listening knows who is the National Security Council. Well, I'll tell you, it's 4 people. It's the President, the Vice President, the Secretaries of State and Defense. 3 of those are appointed by the President. So by signing the National Security Act of 1947 into law, we basically set up a dictatorship, because the President is now in charge of everything that has to do with national security, and this bypasses Congress and the news media and the public. And this is when we began to move into a national security state, which at the heart of which lay these Nazis, unreconstructed Nazis.
So to get back to Germany, you have them discovering free energy somehow. I mean, certainly they had really amazing scientists.
Right.
Okay. And they were looking into other dimensions, using psychics, using remote viewing, using possible channeling. And what you're saying is they may have been also getting technology out of those dimensions, information that they needed to build things.
Right.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And there is a connection to Egypt, right? And to the Sumerians, cylinder seals. A lot of the technology
all of this is
back
part
there.
of the Earth's history.
Right.
And it all fits together. For example, you know, for the longest time, everybody thought that Egypt was the world's first greatest civilization. Well, you know, and that's because it wasn't until the mid-1800s that they began to discover these strange mounds over in Mesopotamia, which is now modern-day Iraq, and they began to excavate and find that there's huge cities under there. And they began to discover the Sumerian civilization, which predates the Egyptians by at least 5,000 years. And so what we're actually finding out today is that apparently there was, in antediluvian times, a worldwide, highly technological civilization that probably covered the entire world. This is why they found pyramids in Central America, South America, China, Eastern Europe, the Giza Plateau, and yet something happened. There was either earth changes, or there was a war, or something, and this whole civilization crumbled. And what we know is our written history, the Sumerians, and then the Babylonians, and then the Assyrians, and then the Phoenicians, and then the Egyptians, and these were all degradations of the same civilization. And the proof of that, for example, is in the history of Egypt. The earliest dynasties were the most advanced dynasties, and then it devolved, it degraded, and went all the way down until we ended up in the middle, in the Dark Ages, and then we've been slowly pulling ourselves out ever since. And this is why that the people in the know, and knowledge is power, and they want to keep the knowledge, and they don't want us to know what's going on. But this is why they are rushing around the whole world, just like Indiana Jones chasing the Nazis who were chasing the historic and religious, icons and
yeah,
artifacts,
absolutely.
Because they're trying to get to this ancient technology.
Okay, and so you just spent some time in Egypt, didn't you?
Yes.
And did you find anything when you were there that blew your mind, or?
Yes. Under the Temple of Seti, which is an immense temple and just filled with hieroglyphics, underneath that is a huge temple called the Osirian, and it is huge megalithic blocks that would probably weigh 10 and 12 tons each. No hieroglyphics on these, but they're stacked up very similar to Stonehenge, but they are not rough rock like Stonehenge. These are perfectly finely cut pieces and that butt up against each other so perfectly you can't even put a piece of paper in there. And this is under the Temple of Seti, which means there was something going on over there long before the Egyptians came along.
Are they releasing this into the public domain?
No, in fact, we weren't even supposed to be able to go down there, but we managed to kind of slip down there and see what was going on. This is the stuff they keep hidden. The same thing is that on the Sphinx, it is just obvious that there is deep water erosion grooves on the sides of the Sphinx and on the sides of the ground surrounding it, which means that this is vertical water erosion. The Sphinx and the area around it had set out under heavy rains.
You actually got into this place, which is under the Temple of Seti, you're saying, which is built like Stonehenge, has polished stones.
Right. No hieroglyphics. It obviously predates the Seti Temple, and so there's, again, more proof that there was something going on of a highly technological nature long before the Egyptians came along.
So do they know, are they dating it at all? Did anybody give you an indication when?
No, there is a huge resistance to all of this, and I couldn't quite understand the resistance until I visited in Egypt and realized that they're totally dependent upon the tourist dollar and upon the whole idea of the pharaohs and Cleopatra and Nefertiti and da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and they just really can't afford to back off of that. They don't want to admit that there was anything going on other than the conventional history, and of course everyone else who's an Egyptologist or whatever, they've got an entire lifetime, they've got books written, they've got a whole career based on their theories and their interpretation of what the Egyptians were doing, and to say that that really wasn't quite the truth of it, then that just throws it all into a cockhat, and they're totally opposed to that. However, the geologists who go and look at this very obvious water erosion on the Sphinx will tell you that that's obviously water erosion, and historically there has not been any heavy rains on the Giza Plateau for 10,500 years, which means the Sphinx and probably the Great Pyramid predate the Egyptians by at least 5,000 years. In 5,000 years, it's hard for us to think of 5,000 years. Most people today think about the war between the states. That just sounds like ancient history. And yet, my grandmother told me about when her father came back from the war. So it really hadn't been that far back. And yet, to us, it's ancient history, and that was, only about 150 years ago. So to talk about 5,000 years, my God, we have a hard time even contemplating that. But there's no question that it points out to alternative origins for the human race and the human species. And again, how can we figure out what's going on today if we don't know where we came from or the truth of our beginnings? And what I was going to tell you is, this is really fascinating, is that they are bricking up the sides of the Sphinx, ostensibly because they said, well, it's deteriorating and we don't want it to be destroyed, so we're going to brace it up and we're going to fix it up and preserve it, But what they're doing is they're covering up the signs of erosion. The very obvious signs of vertical water erosion, which means it predates the Egyptians.
Well, what about the fact that there's also supposed to be a library inside the Sphinx?
There's another thing. Edgar Cayce back in the 30s, the great seer, he says, well, there's a room under the left paw of the Sphinx. The Army remote viewers, by the way, took a look at that, and they said, yeah, there's a room in there. And I said, what's in it? And they said, jars and vases and with scrolls and tablets, you know. And I'm going, whoa, holy cow, the Hall of Records. Here we can really find out what's going on, you know.
Absolutely.
And then they used ground penetrating radar.